Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 785, December the 22nd, 1986. I sort of rushed through a quick holiday greetings on the last broadcast. I do want to say have a good holiday and a very, very happy new year. My radio listeners, my World Watchers, are really just as close as my family. Some of them I've learned to like very, very much and become good friends with. I wish I had time to spend with more of you, and I appreciate your consistency and your friendship, the books you send, the articles, and the contacts. It helps a lot to exchange information, and some of you are just super at the job of clipping and passing on information. And even if you don't do it, I still appreciate your long listening, or your new listeners, my new listeners who have come on so enthusiastically and learned to take the pace of this show. It's pretty fast, this broadcast, and stayed with it. As far as Ronald Reagan goes and the scandals that have been going on for the past 2 months, they fight over or discuss what to title this event. I call it REAGANGATE. That covers it all because it all emanates from the White House, and so therefore it should be right there, just as Watergate began at the Watergate Hotel. This is REAGANGATE. This is his baby. This is what he always wanted when he became president, to have his own private army, his little Rambo group of people that could go around the world and knock out all the commies, and he would sit out at Camp David on the weekends and see old-fashioned movies. Don't write him off too quickly, even though he has surgery and he's getting old and his memory is fading and so forth. He's a cornered man, and a cornered man can be very dangerous. And he can escalate his powers even to a position where he stays in the third term. The danger of Ronald Reagan is that he is always identified with Franklin Roosevelt. While he wanted to turn all of Roosevelt's programs back to where they were when he first became president, continuing the old Herbert Hoover tradition, he identified with his stamina and having a third term, even in a wheelchair and being sick. And he quotes Roosevelt all of the time and has this visual image of Roosevelt. So he could easily present the situation whereby he couldn't afford to leave because of events in the world taking place that he might have instigated in the first place, just as Adolf Hitler did in Poland with the agent provocateurs. George Shultz in 1984 was angry that the administration was hamstrung by the Congress. He said they didn't give the president enough War Powers Acts. There were articles. Shultz lambasted the War Powers Act as too restrictive, and he cited the example in Lebanon where the U.S. policy was hamstrung because we couldn't send in U.S. troops. Well, that was 1984. Now we find out in 1986 that the president knew that Iran was behind the bombings of the Marines and the embassy in Lebanon, and also that we were sending arms to Iran, and Israel was sending arms to Iran at the same time that this was taking place. Shultz wants the War Powers Act. In other words, we arm Gaddafi, arm Iran, and then we have an excuse for Reagan's biblical Armageddon by sending the troops in and getting them firmly established into the Middle East so that we can be close to Iran, that is, as you've heard 3,000 times now, geographically important enough to start World War III. They've said that many times during these various interviews and explanations for the behavior because of the border next to Russia and the access to the Baltic Sea. Now, just in the past few weeks, keeping that in mind, just 2 days ago, Ronald Reagan said that he wanted MX missiles on trains on a regular railway system, and they would cost $65 billion. He wants 50 more MX missiles. We don't have enough yet, and on the one hand, he talks about reducing them, and he's requested approximately $65 billion. That's for 50 MX missiles. And the reason now, he says, is to send a message to Moscow. He also announced this past Sunday something which is no surprise to World Watcher listeners or readers of the books that I suggest, such as Project Paperclip, that he wants to turn the space station for Star Wars and military into the Defense Department. And he said this might upset Japan, Europe, or Canada, but the Defense Department wants to take over the entire space program. And of course, this has to do with Daniel Graham and Edward Teller and Project Paperclip and the very people that are involved in the National Security Council with the Iran and Contragate agents that are skirting around the country in the Middle East and in Central America and in Zaire and Congo and Brunei and Philippines, and you know where else. There's about 27 countries involved now. General Brent Scowcroft was assigned by Ronald Reagan to investigate the National Security Council and where the problems are that's giving him so much trouble, the scandals. Scowcroft is vice president of Kissinger Associates. I'll do more on that and about him in a moment. But this past year, he was suggested that we can't eliminate ballistic missiles. They're important. He is one of those pushing now for the $65 billion. In other words, what the NSC did illegally or pushed for the wrong reasons, they are incorporating the very people that want the missile systems and new money to make and deploy. Scowcroft is working in the NSC now with John Tower. Ronald Reagan continues the nuclear testing, even though we've tested enough atomic bombs to blow the world over about 100 or 1,000 times, and therefore the Soviet Union is going to start testing again, and he has thrown out the SALT II agreement. Well, it was never signed, and there are over 60 congressmen trying to stop him, and I think they'll realize that he is a military madman. So while it appears that Washington is so bogged down or tied up or the White House can't function, his military mind is functioning very well, and that is a real danger to us, what he would do if he were really cornered. Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North was crying at press conferences. One quotation in the Boston Globe that was picked up, it said, North feels abandoned by former friends and so-called friends and colleagues. He feels a growing disenchantment and anger at the way the White House is treating him. He doesn't mind the $5 million or more book arrangement they set up for him in California. Jeff Bridges may play the role of Ollie North. Money isn't everything, particularly if you have to go to jail for a week or 2 or 6 years like G. Gordon Liddy, and he's not going to jail. He's going to be pardoned, but he's crying about being abandoned. And the other partner of this team, the second wimp in this whole affair, is Nancy Reagan, who says her husband feels deceived. He was misled by former aides. He's frustrated because, quotes, nobody is happy and jubilant about being deceived. Now, Ronald Reagan has never been deceived. He's the great manipulator, not only of the news, but the policies and the laws and the powers that be. He's worked with the inner team since the days when he was in Hollywood, going way back to the late 40s. And Ollie North has played a role that he was trained to do, and now they're publicly crying as if they are so hurt. They're not national heroes. They might have thought they would be, and they'll be well paid. And I'm sure, like Klaus von Bülow and G. Gordon Liddy later, they'll feel very well paid off and more secure in their position. But right now, Nancy and Ollie are doing a lot of crying. Now, keep in mind that this huge scandal keeps growing. The special prosecutor has decided that instead of having 20 investigators, they needed 60. And instead of it lasting 1 month, it's going to last 1 year. And Senator Inouye says there are very serious charges. So the problem isn't going away. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, or should be, knows absolutely nothing about what's happening. Donald Reagan, his chief of staff, former head of Merrill Lynch, a large Wall Street brokerage firm that still exists, where Larry Speakes will soon be earning $250,000 a year. The White House press secretary, he doesn't know anything that's going on. He testified, didn't have to take the fifth because as former Secretary of the Treasury, as a member of the National Security Council, he doesn't know a thing that's going on, hasn't seen or heard a thing. CIA Director William Casey didn't know anything. His mind was refreshed, and as his recollection was about to come back and he was going to testify the next day, just last Monday his little arms and legs started shaking in the CIA building, and he was put in an ambulance where he had brain surgery the next day. George Shultz, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, high executives of the huge multi-billion-dollar Bechtel Corporation, running this government from the standpoint of meeting other countries and militarily speaking, control of NATO and so forth, they know absolutely nothing. The only ones who must be knowing something are the witnesses who are literally dying like flies all over the globe and have been killed in connection to these teams for the past 1 or 2 years. Last week I started some of the deaths, and I'm going to continue them next week. I'm going to take 1 week off and just get back to cataloging some of this material for an overview for you over Christmas and New Year's. The REAGANGATE story has been developing for 2 months. I'm constantly readjusting my files, and as I said once before in the air, a subscriber in the Los Angeles area wrote to me and asked, how do you go about putting material together on these particularly large stories? And they begin with one small aspect and they grow and grow. So just to give you an give you an idea of how I'm arranging the cataloging of the material and the range that it covers, I'm going to share that with you this evening, maybe continue it next week to finish off the air, because the files keep growing, but just this is about a quarter of what I have, but all that I can put on the air in 1 hour. Now, when I refer to books, I told you I use these large art books. They're different colors, like 48 different pages, and I put on the cover of them A to Z and subjects that go into those books. They have a pretty good binding, strangely enough, and I have broken down this material so far into 6 of those books with 48 different sections. And to have a section doesn't mean one article. It can be a lot of articles, but a certain section of this REAGANGATE story goes in one book or in another, and I'll share them with you and just describe to you what are in the first 2 books so you can get an idea of the range of the story. Now, in a case like this, or in all of these matters, there are the planners and the winners. Somebody wins, and you always look for who was the winner and who would gain from this. And so far, the 2 that stay aside, that are public prominent, that are displayed as the epitome of statesmanship, are Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, of course. They're on television, talk shows, dressed up in tuxedos, going to banquets, making all kinds of innuendos. Henry Kissinger had a column this week, "Nobody standing by the president," and he's just sitting there grinning from ear to ear, waiting for next year for the Constitution to change, whereby he can become president. Don't take that "Hail to the Chief" lightly that they play at the Bohemian Grove when he goes there in the summers. And the planners and the winners are the ones I look at first. So in book 1, which I call the Major Conspiracy Connections, because I believe that this is a possible agent provocateur situation set up through Mr. Hassenfuss and the newspaper in Lebanon to remove President Reagan and Vice President George Bush and make the way for these 2 pillars of government, these heads of states, these majestic figures such as Haig. Now, when Richard Nixon was in the White House, Alexander Haig called down to Australia to Mr. Alex Butterfield of the Air Force, come to Washington and start taping the conversations in the White House. That was about the way the dialogue went. "We come to Washington, I need you." And Butterfield went up to Washington and was in charge of the White House tapes for the not the Defense Department, but that little pocket under Haig and the White House. And that brought the president out, and it brought in Haig as chief of staff. And Henry Kissinger sat with the mumbling Nixon, who was going crazy, in the Lincoln Room talking to himself, and Henry Kissinger looked great on top. Now, above all this, if we have that triangle again, is that Gustav Anton Fritz Kraemer, former plans officer for the Pentagon. He ran his offices over Mr. Westmoreland in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and most of the people involved in the Contragate story, both in Iran and Central America, worked under Fritz Kraemer and Henry Kissinger in Laos and were part of the Pentagon entourage that were formed right before Kennedy was killed, at the time of the invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, then into the Kennedy assassination, and then Southeast Asia. And they all converge again in the National Security Council, the Defense Department, the CIA, in Iran and in Central America. I would say that Kraemer is the highest on this team, and next to him, sharing offices with him, as I mentioned before, is Daniel Graham. So in book 1, I have a section on Kraemer and where he connects to any of these particular people in the news. Under him, Daniel Graham, former head of the DIA, and his offices with Kraemer, and under that, Fred Ikle, and where every time there's a mention of Fred Ikle, whether he worked with Zbigniew Brzezinski in National Security Council or Mr. Carlucci, the new head of the NSC, I put Carlucci and Ikle into that section, and every article pertaining to Ikle and the safe house in London that these people use, the Mossad, the Saudi Arabians, for arms to Iran, I put under his name. And then a section of Henry Kissinger and his relationship to these particular people, to the National Security Agency, the way he set it up, the references to him in editorials or articles, and how he was behind instigating the secret team for the machinations that they're doing now. Alexander Haig and his specific relationship to arms to Iran, going on from 1980, the late 1980 and 81 until Reagan was reelected in 1984, and his relationship to Michael Ledeen and George Bush with the arms and military Alexander Haig. And then a section in this book, this is section 6 or page 6, I have tabs that number them, the articles about the coups of the colonels, how the colonels take over the White House. I've had some of them on the air. The next section is on the National Security Council as it was structured in 1947. I've shared some of that with you. The next is the National Security Council, the rat holes in the wall, the hidden access, the programs not viewed by the government outside of the Defense Department, the CIA, and the State Department running on their own, their secret group. And then beyond that is another section on the super SISMI that is behind even the National Security Council. So the one that is set up for its special operations of the 40 Committee and so forth. There's a group even smaller than that of 3 men here and 3 from the defense, and how they connect to Iran and Central America and other operations around the world where we have the freedom fighters, whether it's Angola, Afghanistan, and so forth. Then the investigation of the National Security Council. I have one section on that, and then broken down into 3 parts. General Brent, Scowcroft, John Tower, and Ed Muskie. Scowcroft was vice president of Kissinger Associates. On the board of that group is William Rogers, who investigated the Challenger, who's involved with William Casey. He's Casey's law partner in all kinds of financial entanglements with Jay Dominelli's suit in San Diego, with missing billions down in the Philippines, with Marcos offshore investments from New York. Robert O. Anderson of Richfield, and I mentioned him because he's just one member of a board of a team that's funding the Contras or covert action that are put together by the Defense Department but look like civilian groups. So Rogers and Anderson are part of other operations and work with Kissinger and Scowcroft. Then John Tower and his relationship to Marina Oswald and his homosexual scandals that were written in a book I referred to earlier with Secretary of State John Lehman and Henry Kissinger, and Ed Muskie, the third wimp on that panel, still suffering from the Watergate LSD. Poor guy's either got Parkinson's or a hangover from the Watergate era. And they are investigating the National Security Council. And then that section on the super SISMI, which I've had on the air and shared with you, set up by Henry Kissinger and tied into the international fascista with Klaus Barbie and Lucio Gelli, who was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and that makes a full cycle to the cocaine and drug connections later. Then under elections, this is in book 1, the section on elections, and I have 6, and I'm adding a few more sections on that. One has to do with the hostage crisis in 1980, 1979, and 80, and the payoff of arms to Iran for holding up the hostages until Reagan was elected versus Jimmy Carter. The other is the use of Israel and arms to Iran by way of Alexander Haig from 1981 to 84 for the same purposes. The other is the Cartergate papers, the stolen papers with CIA Deputy Max Ugel, H-U-G-E-L, close friend of William Casey, Edwin Meese, all to assure the Reagan election in 1980, and there are 1,000 pages of government hearings, 2 books on that I have, and I'm photocopying areas to show how the Cartergate affected the elections and why those stolen papers were needed by Ronald Reagan. Then the hostage crisis in 1985-86 and the frantic search to get them home so that the Senate would have a preponderance of Republicans, which Ronald Reagan wanted, and governors, which he got. Then the Michael Ledeen connections to Billygate in 1980, trying to discredit Jimmy Carter and setting him up through Italy, through the P2 and Henry Kissinger, those operations, and also the use of Western goals and the computerized lists for people who are against the Contras funding or against Star Wars, and the use of John Singlaub, Edward Teller, Admiral Moore, Eugene Wigner, Hans Stenholz. I've mentioned them over and over before. But under elections, the use of these organizations or these situations that tie in to the above, such as the planners like Kraemer, Graham, Ikle, Kissinger, and Haig, all of these relate back to them, and they have to do with altering our elections. The next file section in this book, instead of putting them in separate files, I lay the articles flat, and turn the pages, as I say, and have identification so I can refer and see the articles instead of pulling out files all day. They're all in one book. One book can have 48 sections. It gets pretty heavy, but I do at least up to 30 sections. A section on all the articles about Haig in 1980, Arms to Iran, and United Technology up to 1986, because Haig was president of United Technology, so what began as an electoral victory in 1980 was continuing by way of their Canadian franchise instead of out of Connecticut in 1986 for the same purposes that Reagan needed at this time. Then Fred Ikle, the very important man from the Defense Department, I keep one section on winners or losers in his relationship to Mr. Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter and the Defense Department and the CIA and his plans to destabilize Poland and Solidarity. Then under Ikle, I have the other articles about the links of Michael Ledeen to discredit Poland and the KGB and the Bulgarian connections, and bringing in the fact that Agca was going to shoot Lech Walesa, and the disinformation and counterintelligence that had to do with Poland. And Ikle ties up to the front groups in London that later, his connections to the late Hashemi or Adnan Khashoggi. He ties into the Defense Department plans that I've had on the air for you of a meeting in 1983-84 whereby private organizations would branch out and appear to be civilian organizations. So I have Ikle under two separate groups. Then a section on group and front organizations. Well, that alone has 30 files, and they're very full, and they are what they're referred to as humanitarian or religious fronts. I listed 12 of them on broadcast 783, December the 8th, but there are 30 or more. I have 30 front organizations that are all interconnected. The boards are interconnected, and the important thing about them is they reach up to Lieutenant Colonel North and Fred Ikle and the Defense Department and the White House, and they appear, as I say, to be charity organizations, but they're busy all over the world, whether it's to overthrow Ghana. They had their finger in that, and some men were arrested. When this story broke, the 4 men were allowed to leave the jail in Brazil. I'll update more on that later. They are getting ready to overthrow Suriname now, and these teams meet and send in like Christian aid, medical aid, and so forth that are connected directly to our Defense Department. Then there's the Henry Kissinger proteges. I have Kissinger above, waiting there to be president, but his proteges in the REAGANGATE are such people like Robert McFarlane, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, and Lehman connects to other corporations like Northrop. I'll bring that up in a minute. It has its own file. But Michael Ledeen and Ledeen's links with McFarlane in Iran, because I believe that their visit there was set up as agent provocateurs, and I'll develop more of that for you. The purpose being that Mr. Haig and Mr. Kissinger come out squeaky clean. We keep hearing references that Ronald Reagan wanted to be like Henry Kissinger by opening up Iran as Kissinger opened up China. The point is that you could send someone to speak with Khomeini, you could speak in Iran, but what they're trying to do is get rid of Khomeini and put in the Savak and the repressive government that the people revolted against before that would never work, and also they were shipping billions of dollars of arms. We didn't ship arms to China before we talked and then ship arms. And then a separate folder section on Michael Ledeen, his location at the Center for Strategic International Studies, his work with the Defense Department, going into the Defense Department for weapons, his being the architect of the KGB Bulgarian Pope plot. Ledeen goes in with this category of the very highest movers and shakers. Ledeen was on Nightline last week like an elder statesman with various persons discussing problems that are taking place, not as a man who was told never to be allowed in Italy, not as a man with Francesco Pazienza, with ties to Licio Gelli of the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo. No blushing about this Jew working with the International Odessa, the Nazis, the drug dealers. He's on there as if he were a statesman, and you might have seen it. I've been videotaping TV night and day as much as I can on these programs to get these faces. Another section I have in Book 1 is on Richard Perle, very important, from the Defense Department, and his links with John Lehman, Edward Teller, Noel Koch from the Defense Department, and Michael Armacos from the Defense Department. They worked in the National Security Council with the colonels. They set up the safe house in London for Mr. Khashoggi, Mr. Hashemi, and they work with Saudi Arabia, with the Israeli Mossad, and the United States. They're really a triangle. If you think that Israel and Saudi Arabia are enemies, make another guess. They're very close, and Perle, Lehman, Teller, Koch, and Armacos set up the nucleus of these arrangements between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I don't expect you to remember all these names or connections. I'm just telling you the sections that I have, and that I'm taking material from the daily news that is coming as the stories break and putting it into these sections, and then adding to that section the stuff that I had on these people already, where they were working together and what they were doing. The next section is on the Bruni connections. I've had that on the air with you, with George Shultz and Bechtel Corporation and Defense Department, Elliot Abrams, who's in charge of Central America, and funds for the Contras, or millions for anything else the Defense Department wants, and in return, we let Brunei become one of the world's worst dictatorships, a total monopoly of one person against all the people, controlling all the oil and gas and the resources of Brunei. Then there's the Philippine connections that, again, go into William Casey and Wim Rogers, his law partner. It has to do with General Fabian Ver. There's a subpoena for him in relation to sending arms to Iran. And Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, of course, are tied into that. This has to do with Philippine drugs and money, the flow of money into America and Swiss banks, and again being used for the Iranian armaments by our Defense Department and National Security. And of course the two big actors in that scene are Paul Laxalt and Senator Lugar from Indiana, who are very close to William Casey and keep a hold on Corazon Aquino. And of course over there not 2 weeks ago, I guess it must be 3 by now, was John Singlaub and Thomas Cline, our two super agents of the secret team, who could in fact be arranging for the murder of Corazon Aquino. This is what they're used for and what they do the best, and they come right out of the national security again with the President and Oliver North and George Bush. Another section I have in book 1, you see, is getting very full. Soon I'll take it out of the pages and make file folders of these subjects, but while I'm working with them and the news is breaking fast, I keep them in these books, then take hunks out, put them in a folder. It's easier to separate them in the news as the news comes. The next section is on Frank Carlucci, the gentleman who's been appointed to become the new director of the National Security Council. Everybody loves him. George Shultz, Secretary of State, and Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense. He comes from that early team of Kissinger and Kraemer and Daniel Graham of the Defense Department and the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency, and he helped administer at least 5 military dictatorships and coups that I'll go into with you. The background on Carlucci and the articles coming about him, plus the things that I had, I put in a section called Carlucci NSC, and he assisted Fred Ikle, again, Ikle the partner of Graham and Fritz Kraemer. Fred Ikle was his assistant. He worked... Carlucci worked with him to destabilize Poland and put in solidarity as a thorn in the side of the Soviet control over Poland, just as we are arming and sending guns to people in Iran to overthrow Khomeini. Ikle used Frank Carlucci together in the Pentagon and in the CIA, and he was deputy CIA director under Jimmy Carter's Jonestown when 1,912 people were dead. And that was the time when Brzezinski was part of the Jonestown scandal, covering it up, and persons in the Carter administration were very much behind the mind-controlled experimentations and what was going down in Jonestown at the time. The next section is on Admiral John Poindexter. He's very much a part of this inner team and probably has been for a long time. To his credit, he takes masterminding the Libyan raid, the Libyan disinformation. He oversaw the Iranian arms deals. He planned the Grenada invasion from 1983. And he has a history bragging about lying to the American people. And, of course, he kept the press out of Grenada when that hospital was bombed. And I compared it to Jonestown and Jimmy Carter and the same persons, Peter Byrne, Dr. Peter Byrne, the medical school in Grenada, and the relationship to Guyana. And the cast here from Grenada and Guyana overlaps identically, and I suggest that you go back and listen to the tapes I did on those programs. I was ready to write articles on Grenada. I really should put them together. But Carlucci is part of that whole milieu of Poland, of Michael Ledeen, and discrediting the Polish and the Bulgarian and the KGBs. And these people have worked as a team for a long time. So it's just natural that he would be appointed as new national security advisor. Then the Canadian connections are ready to go out of a book and into their own files. They're so huge. They involve William Casey and Roy Fermark. I barely got into it last week. Now this past week, last couple of days, there's mention of John Gamble, Gamble, from Canada, as a member of the World Anti-Communist League and attending the meetings down in Dallas last year. And the Canadian connections involve Adnan Khashoggi, who isn't as rich as people think. He's made a lot of bets and done a lot of gambling, and he owes Mr. Fermark approximately $21 million. They made loans to him. So when Khashoggi is put against the wall, he'll put out stories for blackmail, and it was this threat of blackmail that got William Casey off his butt and began to break these stories because the connections were coming in over his head that had to do with large amounts of missing money and loans and arms to Iran. There are no nice guys in this story, and these connections of blackmail and gambling debts and arms dealing debts involving Saudi Arabia, the United States, White House, and so forth get more interesting as the story goes on and linked to John St. Laub and the World Anti-Communist League. We'll take a 1-minute break now and then come on to Book 2. That's just Book 1. As I say, they'll go into file folders probably this next week. I'm going to share with you Book 2, the kinds of connections that are developing along other lines. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, program number 785, December the 22nd, 1986. I don't expect you to remember the names or the categories that I'm citing to you. Some I've already shared with you on the air, and I'm putting them in the context of where I think they belong at the present time, and others I'll develop at great length with you and give you the specific articles and so forth. I'm taking material from the newspapers that I take daily, and then there are friends from around the country that send me articles from Oregon, from Houston, from I get in these Times, Nation, The Guardian, and information on Central America, the Western Hemisphere. So as I am cutting the articles pertaining to REAGANGATE, I'm putting them into the notebooks I described, maybe 1 up to 6, and each one having its separate 48 sections if I want to use that many, but you can see they get pretty heavy. Then turning them into files and separating the material so if I want to get access to it to compare or to connect, I can. And I spread these materials out all over a large king-size bed and 2 tables once a week, and then accumulate those subjects that relate to each other, like, say, articles on George Bush. There are opinions of Bush, there are speeches of Bush, there's pleadings with Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North to speak. Then there are links of George Bush to Central America that I'll go into, and there's links to George Bush to the Iran story. So I have Bush under 3 categories: the general news media articles about and so forth, then the direct connections to the other 2 areas, which are separate from the first one, so that I can get access to those instead of going through a whole pile of articles and looking for a particular item. Now, Book 2 is on other conspiracy connections or international links. Many of them I've had on the air over the past years, and now the names of particular persons and operations connect to the REAGANGATE as it is being exposed. It's one thing to see it as a separate entity in a newspaper and share a single article with you, and I always try to make connections to a lot of other eras and years and people that these articles relate to. But the second book I have is on some of these connections that are coming together at this time. And as I say, the first one is on the planners and winners, who gains and who loses. And Fritz, Kraemer, Daniel, Graham, Fred, Ikle, Henry Kissinger, Alexander, Haig, Michael, Ledeen, and their team, Richard, Perle, John Lehman, Edward Teller, seem to be the ones on top while everything else falls apart. They're the ones that gain the most and could be behind this with agent provocateurs, doing the things that remove Ronald Reagan and George Bush, identical to Watergate, where Nixon and Agnew were removed, And again, Kissinger and Haig came out smelling like a rose. Now, book 2 has, let me see how many connections there are for you here. There's so many. We'll just go on to them. I have 12 major connections, but we'll do those and then the 13th, which is much larger. It's a whole book by itself. Okay, the first one is the Nazi Odessa connections to the REAGANGATE. This has to do with Albert Hakim and General Secord and Stanford Technology with its offices in Palo Alto and also in Virginia. The second part under that is Stanford Technology and TCI, the corporation that was formed when Otto von Bolschwing was the head of it and Helene von Dahm was the translator. Then the third part under that is Helene von Dahm and her relationship to Ronald Reagan as secretary for 8 years, as appointment secretary in the White House for 2 administrations, and a relationship to Albert Hakim and his organizations overseas. That just came out in a very good article. It was printed in the West Coast this past week. Then the relationship of Donald Reagan, chief of staff, to Credit Suisse, the bank used by Stanford Technology, and the connections of Merrill Lynch to Credit Suisse and REAGANGATE. And what are the common denominators? I know these are large banks, but what are the common denominators? If von Bolschwing was the head of the Gehlen operation when Reinhard Gehlen went back to Europe, and Gehlen was the chief intelligence for the Eastern Division of Adolf Hitler, who formed our National Security Council and CIA, then the Hakim connections are working well with General Secord, with Mr. Adnan Khashoggi, and the Saudi Arabian Mossad, United States Defense Department triangle is exactly what von Bolschwing wanted and set up. And then the Credit connections, Credit Suisse to Permindex, the operation for killing heads of states, removing them, and having military coups, because that's what the 40 Committee is in the National Security Council, and this is what these people do well. They want to overthrow Mr. Ortega in Nicaragua. They killed Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and the story of killing heads of states and having coups, such as Mr. Carlucci helping Vernon Walters have the coup in Brazil in 1964, right after John Kennedy was killed. The money for Permindex, the main bank, there were 3 or 4 banks, but Credit Suisse was very much a part of that. And so under these Odessa connections with Hakim, Secord, Saudi Arabia, Stanford Technology, articles are coming out mentioning von Bolschwing and von Dahm, and also Credit Suisse under the money tree connections, and Donald Reagan's connections with Credit Suisse and Merrill Lynch, and Credit Suisse with Permindex, and also the Merrill Lynch connections to Sao Paulo, Brazil, to Joseph Mengele and Klaus Barbie, because those, in return, they're drug connections and money connections and deposits in the Boston Bank in E.F. Hutton, where George Bush's brother-in-law is president, Mr. Pierce of E.F. Hutton, and the head of Merrill Lynch, where the drug money was coming in, is now chief of staff in the White House. I call those the Nazi Odessa connections because they go all the way from the SS with Otto von Bolschwing out to TCI, to Stanford Technology, to Hewlett-Packard, to von Dahm, who's in Vienna, and Hakim using von Dahm's, she is setting up or using his networks, and there's a very nice circle around the globe if you follow them long enough. The next section under that are the George Bush connections that I briefly mentioned before, when Mr. Hassenfoss went down, and his mentioning Mr. Gomez Rodriguez and the links to National Security Council to George Bush's top aide, the murder of Che Guevara, the Bolivia police, the Klaus Barbie, Licio Gelli, Ronald Reagan, GOP, drug Nazi connections. Now, parts of these I've had on the air for years, but when you get George Bush and the scandals of the National Security Council with Mr. Rodriguez acting in Bolivia and in El Salvador and training the Contras now, there is a very tight circle here of those would also be part of the Odessa connections. I call them the George Bush connections. Then the Bush-Contra-Gate connections, besides that, go into the Letelier murder, the Air Cuba, the connections to General Secord, to Rafael Quintero, Theodore Shackley, Posada Carriles, who was took credit or was charged with blowing up Air Cuba, George Bush's murderous activities when he was CIA director in 1976 and the continuation of them now, and the formation of these people at the time of the Bay of Pigs. They went on to become partner of the Defense Department and the national security in the killing of John Kennedy, and then on to Vietnam and Laos. And now you see them working both in Iran, in the REAGANGATE story, and in Central America, and the funds tangled and meshed. The banking connections overlap, the agents overlap, the role in the Bay of Pigs and the murder of John Kennedy. The common denominator would be, I'll give you some names in regards to one particular person later, but there's a lot of overlapping, but it has to do with current news now, putting it together with the past articles. And then there's the George Bush arms for Iran. He's been called in as a witness, the late Cyrus Hashemi. He was murdered in London in July, and he was a primary witness in that particular case. But again, that has to do with Saudi Arabia. Adnan Khashoggi, whose particular attorney, Mr. Evans, was arrested with Gurl Eisenberg, and I've done a little bit on that operation. And the attorney, Jonathan Marks, who works for Gurl Eisenberg, is also the attorney for Mark David Chapman. And Bush links to the Gomez Rodriguez International Fascist Bolivia, Guevara murder, Barbie Triangle, and Jelly, who was at Ronald Reagan and Bush's inauguration party, the first one in 1980, and they were down in Dallas for the re-election campaign in 1984, the top Bolivian cocaine dealers waiting to return to Bolivia. Bush linked to Contragate, the Central America death squads, going to the Bay of Pigs and through the Kennedy assassination into Laos, where they go on to be drug dealers. That's a separate section. This is just on Bush's connections. And then Bush with the arms for Iran, Hashemi, Khashoggi, and Eisenberg, and so forth, and American general, 3 officials of the Mossad, and so forth. So Bush is directly linked into these 3 very important areas. The next section I have, which is quite large, is called Shadowy Network for Arms Transfers. And one has to do with what are called ex-CIA men and ex-defense people still working through the existing agencies. Some of them come up in the lawsuit of the Christic Institute. Some of them come out in return, in exchange for information on Hasenfus and El Salvador and Honduras. And a lot of articles and a lot of good writers are coming through with material they've had also, and putting together this private network of people. It showed up, for an example, in the time of Watergate, where these ex-CIA people like E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and Frank Sturgis and so forth were still CIA and still are today for all purposes, and they gave them an X and gave one an office in the White House for emergency planning, and the other was chief of security for Langley, Virginia at the time, James McCord. So all the X's you can erase as just a big nothing, and what they call the X's, like Theodore Shackley and Thomas Clines and John Singlaub, are still working part and parcel with what the White House wants, and all the White House has to say to Mr. North, Colonel North, is, I want this. Then he has the connections to all these people below who spread out like one huge cancer. It starts with one cell and adds another, which is 2. Then he could go to John Singlaub and Western Goals, and then it spreads like wildfire. So that's the private network of ex-CIA and defense. The next is the connection of this network specifically from the Bay of Pigs to the John Kennedy assassinations. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinations, and then on to Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Laos. That connection is the Bay of Pigs to the murder of John Kennedy, the role that these people had and who they worked with. And the next is the drug connections. And of course, this is big. It goes from Laos and Southeast Asia. Not that drugs began there, but that's when these people began to get the money for the guns and exchange guns and drugs and escalate these private armies for the Rangers, the SEALs, and the very people that can overthrow countries quietly without the press being there, such as Grenada, and then use these countries for drug traffic. Also, the islands of the Caribbean. In fact, there was talk after Jonestown of using the property for the Laotian tribesmen that it brought here from Southeast Asia, the ones that were growing the heroin there. So there's the drug connections of this team in Laos with Air America and the airlines that were used for drug traffic, the Nugan Bank with the admirals and generals, and there's a Bernie Houghton from Newton Han who went directly to Saudi Arabia, and the question mark is the role of him with Mr. Khashoggi and John Singlaub and Michael Ledeen and Major General Secord and George Bush and Robert Owen and Thomas Clines, Edwin Wilson, and so forth. The drug connections, the drug dealers, and their operations. And separately from that, but to go into the drug file also are these same people doing drug dealing in Costa Rica using the former location of Robert Vesco, who's floating around the Caribbean with Frank Turple, who connects directly to these people, and Vesco, of course, to William Casey, former partner with William Casey, our CIA director. The drug story is, you could do a lifetime on that, to the REAGANGATE, but it has its own section. The next section is the CIA versus Nicaragua. This has to do with the escalation of arms, the overthrow of Nicaragua, the decision in March '83 in the offices of the Defense Department and the National Security of people like Fred Ikle, and how the overthrow is done. I've done part of those connections of the secret team on World Watchers. I just want to show that that's only one section of this larger group. The next is a file or a partition, which I keep in Book 2, on the Contra organizations. Now, I have in my files, I have 46, I think it's 46 4-drawer filing cabinets, 26 inches deep. That's a lot of files. And I have material on all of these people separately. What I'm putting in these books that I haven't joined to the other files is the new information that's coming out just in since October, November, December of 1986. What I'm citing to you now are new articles, and then to back them up, I have file drawers on organizations of Singlaub and these front organizations, and one full top drawer of the Grenada invasion and these operatives and how they worked in Grenada, one on Wilson and Turple, two on Wilson and Turple and Secord and Singlaub. But right now, what I'm citing to you are sections of just the current news, and one is the material coming out about the Contra organizations, their locations in Washington, in Virginia, in Miami, in Dallas, in Costa Rica, Honduras, and El Salvador, where their pockets are and how the weapons are delivered to them, and how the U.S. military delivers them, these humanitarian things, and delivers the planes, and then the Contras, the recipients of this, don't have to buy weapons. They don't have to buy food or clothing or medical supplies. They take the humanitarian, which means they're living cost-free, plus some extra salaries, and then the money they would spend for the necessities of survival go to the weapons, so it's a fair trade. The next section is on judicial information or investigations that tried to show that the CIA was acting illegally in Nicaragua. Specifically, in 1983, there was a request by Mr. Dulham's, a lawsuit that was filed and turned down. It had to do with military expeditions and involved Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig and Caspar Weinberger acting against the Neutrality Act. That was turned down. The next section is on the Egyptian coup, how these people murdered Anwar Sadat in 1981. And this has to do with General Secord, whose name shows up again in the REAGANGATE, Erich von Marhad, Thomas Clines. Secord and Clines are defendants in the Christic Institute. Their charges against this secret team. The REAGANGATE agents that worked with George Bush at Mubarak had lunch with him, and I had a lot of broadcasts on that 2 days before he went home and Sadat was murdered. EATSCO, EATSCO, a corporation in Delaware, with arms shipments and dummy fronts that was supposed to go to Egypt, but a good hunk of it went on to the PLO and on to Iran, and weapons and money were siphoned from what appeared like legitimate defense contracts, again sending weapons into Iran and through these organizations and front groups. And so the Egyptian coup in 1981 is directly related to the same people involved with the REAGANGATE this time. Then I have a section on the Northrop connections. This has to do with John Lehman and Adnan Khashoggi and Cyrus Hashimi and the contracts and the relationship of Northrop. Northrop comes out at the time of Watergate scandals and payoffs to Richard Nixon and his administration to get him reelected, and the Northrop connections come out in quite a few articles. So whenever I see an article, it may be on something altogether different, but mentions Northrop as a conduit for this spy money or arming Iran or so forth, I just photocopy it and put under Northrop because there's a lot more to that particular organization. Then a gentleman named Fred Maggira passed away a few years ago, Maggira, and I have one section on not too much on him, but he happened to be a member of the Oakland City Council. He was for law and order, a conservative. And then these exposés came out of his relationship to Frank Sturgis, who goes back to Frank Fiorini and the Kennedy assassination, his relationship with guns for the Bay of Pigs, weapons, his contacts with Mitchell Werbel, the famous general from the OSS, who organized Otto Skorzeny's scheme of these small paramilitary guerrilla operations and had training centers his son still has for training and shooting these weapons schools and so forth. There were ties in just this particular person's life to the mafia, to these freedom fighters, to the special forces. And again, this Mr. Majera was close to a person and worked with a person who was a member of the U.S. Special Forces who murdered Che Guevara in Bolivia in 1967, and he helped with persons set up factories in Guatemala to support the Guatemalan police to manufacture silences and so forth. So I throw one section in. Section 9 of Book 2 is just titled JFK, Watergate, Bay of Pigs, the late Frank Majera, and in there we make, again, the Che connections which go to Mr. Rodriguez, George Bush's contacts, our CIA contacts, and it makes a full circle from the CIA and the Defense Department to the murder of John Kennedy, to the Special Forces, to Guatemala police states, to the national security, and so forth. And he fits right into this picture. David Emery sent me the material on him, a couple of years ago, but now it's very pertinent because those persons involved with killing Che Guevara are active and organizers in the Contragate story and acting out of El Salvador to train the Contras and have a history of helping fascist dictatorships and terrorism in Central and South America particularly. So I have just one section on Frank Majera. The next section is on Colonel Oliver North, sending the weapons to Iran via Stanford Technology, working with Mr. Hakim. And, of course, North is connected to the Contragate and the weapons and the money that he promised them they would have in 1984. He says, I promised them as if he runs the country. Colonel North wasn't elected, and his justification is, I made a promise. But all he has to do is to keep up what the president wants, which is to overthrow Ortega. And once that promise is made, he can pass it on. So under North, I have about 8 or 9 sections, and I'll be adding to them all the time. But the first one is his relationship with General Secord in Saudi Arabia. Secord's sending the AWACS to Saudi Arabia, and their work with Nestor Sanchez and Noel Koch of the Defense Department. The other is the relationship of North to the Albert Hakim suit in 1979, a money-skimming arms suit, the relationship of North to Hakim. The next is North to Adnan Khashoggi and Manucher Ghorbanifar and Al Schwimmer and NSC's Charles Tyson. He worked for the National Security Council and went on then to work for Khashoggi. So there isn't any difference between literally the Saudi Arabian, I guess you'd call it their weapons manufacturers or dealers, and the Mossad and the National Security Council. So articles that refer to Ghorbanifar and Khashoggi, Schwimmer, and Tyson, I keep in one special section. Then articles linking Roy Furmark, that gentleman who I cross-file him in several places, to North and the desires of Ronald Reagan to arm the Contras and so forth, and the links of that Canadian scandal to Donald Fraser and E. Miller and William Casey and the CIA, and then the links of them to the World Anti-Communist League and John Singlaub and Michael Ledeen. Then Secord, I have a section under his secret plane that he bought November the 12th, 1985, and decided to register it last week, and it goes up so high that there's no visibility from the ground, and these people have taken large amounts of money from the arms deals or from the drug traffic. We haven't found out yet where it all comes from or whether it's several billion, as we've heard. They're trying to minimize the amount, but they have their own airplanes, they have their own weapons, their own communication system, safe houses, and so forth, and they still connect to the National Security Council right up into the White House. That's why I call it REAGANGATE. And then the links of North to the Bank of Credit Suisse. There's several banks that he was in touch with, quite a few where he opened accounts and so forth, and the relationship of him to these banks, and then the Saudi Arabian Nugan Hand CIA Defense Department. That was all churning around before he came to national security, but where he was before that, we don't have the details and dates. Now, the next large section is on Albert Hakim from Stanford Technology. I mentioned him before under the Odessa and the importance of Hakim with Helene von Dahm and Mr. Secord and Credit Suisse and Merrill Lynch. But under Hakim, I have another section regarding Stanford Technology, and that has to do with the Korean airline. And Section A has to do with the KAL and the United States State Department and arms to Iran, that the KAL has permission from our State Department, it's a section of that, to send arms to Iran, and this happened in 1983. The next has to do with the burglary of Hakim's papers regarding the Korean connections. The third section has to do with the papers being returned, minus the KAL 007 links. It had to do with some obscure plant that was being built for South Korea, and when the papers were returned, we got less information than we did while they were missing. And under that, I have a section on Seymour Hersh and the Korean airline, and Seymour Hersh and his work with the CIA in Chile as a person working in the intelligence system, how he covered up the KAL story. And then the next section is on John Sing Laub and Edward Teller and Daniel Graham and the relationship to Western goals and why they would want Larry McDonald to disappear at that particular time, not survive, the weapons that were gained by it, the silencing of McDonald's testimony, and the links of Oliver North to the KAL. I understand that he is the person that wrote the administration's response to KAL. I'm sure this was written by Buchanan, and I have a section on Ollie North and Thomas Buchanan. They work together hand in glove, and Buchanan seems to be the speech writer. You can recognize his style when all of these things happen, whether it's Chernobyl or KAL, and he comes in with, or the Libyan disinformation, he comes in with the same style, and he works very close with Oliver North, and I have one section on North and Buchanan. The next section is Hairis Hashimi, the Defense Department, his links to mafia and arms to Iran, and this has to do with his involvement earlier, a few years ago, in anti-Iranian crimes that he confessed to. The second part of Hashimi in this section is his New York arrest and the trial of 18 defendants for sending arms to Iran. They were prosecuted on that, but they're appealing it now, saying that they were doing what the government was doing, and they were working with the same people the government is working with. And in that section, I have his work with Ghorbanifar, who was an agent of the Iranian Savak, and how they're trying to set up the Savak, just as in Nicaragua, we're setting up the Somoza army. The young 17, 18-year-olds were not part of Somoza, but their families were, and they want the same benefits of the dictatorship. And in Iran, Hashemi and our Defense Department are working with the Savak, specifically Ghorbanifar. Then Hashemi's work with Oliver North, and in conjunction with Mr. Oliver Revelle of the FBI. Revelle has taken himself off because of conflict of interest investigating these matters, because he was the head of an anti-terrorism team in conjunction with Oliver North, if you can believe how funny that was. And Oliver Revelle has been put aside. I have two categories for him. One is relationship to North and Hashemi and arms to Iran, and the other has to do with the FBI covering up investigations and Mr. Revelle's role in covering up some of these scandals. The next has to do with George Bush's links to the Mossad. It goes, Bush has his own section. Then if he works with Hashemi and he was a witness to the case and they've asked him to appear, I put it under Hashemi as well as Bush because it pertains to both. If I just want to talk about George Bush or study him, I have the conjunction with the place where his name was mentioned, and then if I'm studying a particular area, I double cross-file it, and there's plenty of that in this case. Then under here I have the murder of Dr. Cyrus Hashemi. I mentioned him last week in July in London, and I have another whole section on witnesses that were murdered prior to us getting the story publicly, but were murdered for important reasons, such as Mr. Perry, and then people that have been murdered just in the past week or two, such as Mr. Carr in Los Angeles, a primary witness in this case for the Christic Institute suit. But under the Hashemi Defense Department FBI connections, I also throw the murder of witnesses in this section here because it's pertinent to this story. And then the CIA William Casey links to Mr. Khashoggi. One of the defendants in this case in New York is Mr. Evans, an attorney for Khashoggi, and Khashoggi is very much involved, again, with the Fermar Canadian story and they overlap sometimes. Certain files I have to put under 2 or 3 sections. And then Paul Cutter, known as Paul Sjeklocha, is important in this. He's one of the defendants in this case. And I think I've mentioned before that his attorney who speaks for him all of the time is a Mr. Carroll, Chris Carroll. And he also is the attorney for the very mysterious Carolyn Blazas, who has not been prosecuted. And it was on her parents' property that Leonard Lake had a bunker where approximately 5 to 38 people were murdered with body bags. And Charles Ng, N.G., is the only person arrested in this case as the torturer. Leonard Lake commits suicide. He ate a cyanide bullet and commits suicide. And Charles Ng's name came out as soon as these other stories broke about Hashemi. Not coincidentally, in the past few weeks, he's in Canada for shooting the hand of somebody who arrested him, not a major crime. He should be sent to the United States. Now, another large section having to do with arms to Iran and Hashemi has to do with the Justice Department, Stanley Pottinger and Elliot Richardson, his attorneys, and it's listed under the shadowy connections of Hashemi to JINSA Foundation, JINSA, and I'll be doing a lot of broadcasts on that. JINSA is a formation of an organization in Israel, allegedly Jewish, Israeli, but it has to do with Saudi Arabia, and it's a front organization for people such as John Lehman and Reverend Moon and Barbara Ledeen and Michael Ledeen and Richard Perle of the Defense Department. And Hashemi went to Israel for 2 months, became part of JINSA, and it has links to Abington Corporation, John Lehman, and Northrop comes into this. Arnold Raborshgrape is part of JINSA, and Rafi Eitan from the Mossad from Israel is part of JINSA, and he's the one who said all along he didn't believe that Joseph Mengele was dead. JINSA stands for Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs. Now, Merrill Lynch, as Donald Reagan, set up a fund for Cyrus Hashemi in Switzerland in a Swiss bank, and money was sent to the Bahamas. Yorkshire Trading Company was formed by Mr. Hashemi, the gentleman murdered in London recently who was arming Iran independently and with our Defense Department and with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Yorkshire Trading Company had an investment of $200,000 to get it started from Merrill Lynch, from our Chief of Staff of the White House, Donald Reagan, and they set up another front called First Gulf Bank and Trust. And my time is out now. I only have about 2 seconds. Next week, I'll continue with the categories, probably continue with that, some of the outlines or sections so you can see where some of this news falls into place. I hope you can see. But there are a lot of good stories here, and the murder of a lot of witnesses. I'll update those. I should have done some more this week. I'll do it next week. And I'll give you some large thoughts or areas that I'm going to cover that I'm putting together now so that if I select one or other from the different sections, you can have an overview of where it fits. This is Mae Brussell, and time has run out now, so I can't continue along those lines. Have a very good year. Again, thank you for everything, your support, your books, articles, friendship, and your attention span, which is really great. I'll be back with you next week, the very last World Watchers of 1986, and until then, have some very nice holidays.